Welcome back, everybody, to the 2019 series of the AVH webinars. I see a couple of new faces or names, which is great. And just a quick primer on using this webinar software. You've got a questions box. You can just type in any questions. If you have anything you want to speak about audio-wise, actually, you know what? How about there's only a few people here, so I'm going to see if we have good enough audio quality to unmute.
Nope.
I guess not. Yep. All right. And I was about to say, but if you have barking animals or other background noise, I'm going to keep you muted for now. Just please type in the chat. So let me. I'm going to mute Linda. I think I'm going to mute you back up. Nope. That didn't do the trick, did it? Okay, there we go. The goal for the webinars really is to support each other for our community of homeopaths to be able to ask each question and benefit from any experience from others. Let me just I guess I cannot mute people. So yeah, so if you have any questions, just click on in the upper left of your control panel. You'll see a hand icon that will just raise your hand, and then we'll go to you. And tonight we've got Dr. Beal with us and Dr. Judy Harmon, and all of us, including you guys, are going to discuss some interesting topics. So, Dr. Beal, do you want me to make you a presenter so you can show your slides?
Why don't we do that? I think what we want to spend some time talking about tonight is actually taking the case. And I'm going to just kick this up into full screen stuff. There we go. And everybody can see my screen now?
Yep, looks great.
That works, Steph? Okay.
Yep.
So what I'd like to talk about tonight, and I guess it's sort of fitting that it's kicking off the season's webinar series, is actually taking the case. And one of the things that we find a lot of the times is that actually a case well taken is really half the game done, actually. And sometimes what we end up seeing is that in situations where we're having trouble figuring stuff out, or in situations where we're doing mentoring and folks are having trouble figuring stuff out, it becomes clear during the conversation that there really hasn't been a case taken. And it's one of the failings, I think, of most chapters of homeopathic education, is everybody talks about taking the case, but there's really nothing, or seldom do we have in any kind of a clinical teaching experience where we actually see somebody taking a case or hear somebody taking a case. You might do that if you're on rounds with somebody, but certainly I know that for me, when I went through the professional course in the 90s, that wasn't something that we had. Nobody ever really took a case. We talked a lot about it, and we talked about the importance of it, but nobody ever modeled that behavior for us. And what I found over the last however long is one of the things that problems in cases come down to is actually, how do we do that? And there's a lot of different philosophies and varieties of ways of looking at that. And I'd just like to share my thoughts about that. Some of you have heard me share these thoughts before, and some of you have never heard me share these thoughts before. So I just like to share some thoughts about actually getting the case, getting the material, and also what to do with that when we've got it. That well-taken case is a case half cured, or case well taken is a case half cured. I think that usually gets attributed to Kant. It's probably paraphrasing Hahnemann, Sammy H. talking about that as well. The thing that we have to remember when we're taking the case is it's actually an anamnesis. That's the official name for a case taking. And when we look at the derivation of that word anamnesis, we know that that really means it's a remembering. And I see so often that it isn't really a remembering in so many clinical experiences. It sometimes, in fact, seems like for both the clinician and the client, more of an inquisition. And so I think it's really important that as clinicians, we are in a place where we actually trust the clients. We trust that the client knows that animal the best of anybody. They may not have the big fancy words that they can attach to diagnostic labels, or they may not have the physiology, or they may not have the behavioral background or whatever. And they certainly probably don't have the background of looking at things from the perspective of a homeopath, but they know that animal the best. And it's incumbent, I think, on us to let them tell that story. What I've seen over the years happening in the business of veterinary homeopathy is it tends to be shifting towards looking at the medical records and trying to get the case literally from the paper of the medical records, and the client is somewhat secondary in that experience. And what I find clinically is that usually ends us in a swamp somewhere. One of the things that's really, really important I've found over the years is actually creating an environment so that it is conducive to the work that we have at hand. That's a really hard thing, particularly in situations where we're learning homeopathy or trying to shift our practice from a conventional moderate or high or busy or not as busy, but any conventional type practice where we have quite a bit of client turnover through the hours. We may be working 2 rooms at once, all sorts of different ways. And actually shifting gears, not only putting your homeopathy hat on to start to think like a homeopath and act like a homeopath, but putting your homeopathy hat on so that we can actually slow down the process and slow down the zoom of our typical veterinary days and actually get an environment so that the client is able to present us with the information that we need to do our jobs, and we're able to put ourselves in a position where we can actually receive that information. One of the things that's really common to happen, particularly when we're new clinicians at being homeopaths, is that we're all worried. Can we get the case? Are we going to miss something? Oh my gosh, it's got a big scary label diagnosis. Can we get that fixed or cured or whatever? And bringing those things into the moment of the case taking is not very creative, nor is it very useful, nor is it very conducive to the environment that we want to create. So I ask a lot of times, and it took me a while to sort of sort this out for myself. What does the clinician need? What do I need to create that environment? And what does the client need to create that environment? And one of the things that I found is that I found it for a couple of reasons, is that we need to create a space, it seems to me, that's actually separate from other things, whether that's separate from our clinical Zoom of the day, whether it's separate from the conversations that we have with our clients about other stuff, but we need to sort of separate that space. I found it got really frustrating for me. I get really frustrated because people get the H words all confused anyway, holistic, herbal, homeopathic. They don't really know what those words are when they come, and the differences between that. So if I have a situation where I've had someone in the office and we've talked about general health and vaccinations and diet and supplement and all of this sort of stuff, and then all of a sudden the next thing I'm doing is gathering information for making a prescription, those clients don't tend to separate the homeopathy part or the case taking information remedy prescribing part of the larger art and science of homeopathy from those things that are more of the naturopathic type things, the obstacles to cure, the things that we do to ensure that the patients are nourished well enough to make appropriate symptoms, that we're removing obstacles to cure, those kinds of things. So what I found was when I separated the case taking from all that other stuff that happened, my clients were able to separate that homeopathic process and keep the H word of homeopathy separate from the H word of holistic. That, for my practice, made a huge difference. And that, for my clients, made a huge difference. What I found when I did that, what I ended up doing was actually starting to take cases over the phone. Now, my clinical practice is unique because I had some people that come into the office and some people that never come into the office and some people that come into the office, once in a blue moon. Regardless of whether it's a close client or a far away client, I found that taking the case on the telephone was really helpful. First of all, it separated things in time and space. Secondly, it allowed me to sit at my desk and write because I take cases longhand. And it also allowed the client to be at home in a comfortable place, not worrying about the traffic, not stressed out from the traffic, not worrying about the drive home, not looking out my clinic had big front windows that looked out on the street, not looking at that, not worried what the dog's going to do, not worried that the cat's getting on the ceiling fan, not worried about anything else. So people could really, really focus. And one of the things that I would really suggest to folks, particularly if they're having trouble with that being interrupted or not having people focused or whatever, is just try taking cases by the phone, even if the person lives 10 minutes away from you. The other thing that I find that you need to think about, or I needed to think about certainly, was what are the mechanics, the actual mechanics of the process? Am I going to take my case on the computer? Am I going to write longhand? Am I going to have a questionnaire? Am I not going to have a questionnaire? Those kinds of things. Personally, I take cases longhand. I don't process the information as well. If I'm typing, I find that the computer typing is sort of an impediment between stuff. My thoughts come differently. I can't make notes on the page. I can't zoom arrows up or write myself little notes on the side. So I take cases longhand, and I have that document. I don't retype them. I don't put them back in the computer. I actually maintain a paper file with the case there. And the other thing that I do is I take the case on a different colored paper. So I actually write the case on yellow lined, not legal size, but letter sized paper. I write on one side of the page. I write the full name of the patient on the top of the page. I number the pages. I write a date. I write the first name of the animal on the second page because heaven forbid, maybe the thing will fall on the floor and there'll be 7 page 3s sitting on the floor somewhere. I don't try and repertorize. This is not an acute type case or a follow-up. This is the initial anamnesis. I don't try and repertorize when I'm taking a case. I just start the process. I prep the client. I don't like to have clients send me the story or send me the history or send me the background or send me the whatever. I don't like to do that. I really like to hear what the client has to say. I like to hear what order they present things in, because that tends to sort of both prioritize things that might be concern for the client, but also prioritizes things that are significant for the individual whose case we're trying to gather the information about. So what I tell people is, forget the fact that I just saw Fifi 3 days ago, and forget the fact that we've talked about some of this stuff. We're going to start and try and get all the information in one place. And yeah, I'll look back at the other notes, but this is a time where we actually try and get all the information on the paper at one place and one time. I tell them that it's not a cosmic test. I reassure them that, just as I said earlier, they know this animal the best of all. It doesn't matter that people have more degrees or more letters or fancier words, but they know this animal better than anybody else in the world. And that what we want to do in the time that we have together is that by the end of this time, I want to have a really good sense about the mental, emotional, and physical Fifi, and that they can tell the story however they want to tell the story. If they want to tell it in chronological order, I got Fifi when she was 6 weeks old and this is what happened next, or they might want to tell it in body system order. And the words that I'm saying to you right now are actually the words that I would say to the client, both to prepare them for what we're doing. But I always say it, we're on the phone, I've got my paper in front of me, they're ready and they're nervous, because they want to do a good job, because they're concerned about their animals, and this is a different thing, and they're not used to, they don't know what to expect. They may have read stuff, they don't know what this really looks like in real life. So I tell them just those very things. And when I tell them, that they can tell me the story however they want. I tell them that I'm not going to interrupt very much. I may interrupt to ask some questions, but we'll have some further conversation at the end. And as I say, I tell them however they want to start is fine. You just start, and I'll sort it out at my end. And so they start. Most of my clients over the years tell the story chronologically. They don't tell the story by organ systems. They don't tell the story, oh my God, he's itching so much and that's why I brought them to you. But they tell the story chronologically. This is where I got him. This is where I came from. This is what happened as they were a puppy. And I let them talk. The more that you can write down what the client says in the words of the client, the more accurate your records are going to be, and the more useful that's going to be in both prioritizing and repertorizing. So as much as possible, learn how to record things verbatim. I've always been able to do that. I don't know why. Part of it's training, I think, in school, taking notes, but I find that fairly easy to do. If I'm going to ask a question to a client, and I try not to, I tend to, as they're talking, and I might want to say something. It might be, or not, but usually or it would be something like, oh, and I um, Fifi had um, an ear infection, and I might say, how did they show that? Or I might say, they say something, oh, Fifi just hates doing something. My examples have just gone down the toilet of my mind right now. Fifi just hates little children. And I would say, how so? And they would give me some really good examples. And if I keep those, that's sort of what we call open-ended questionings. If I keep those without making a suggestion to them, then they tell me how Fifi shows that she doesn't like little children, or that what the ear infection was like. If I start asking about discharges and this and this and this and this, you totally, you've totally sucked the person out of their space and into your space. So I record those words verbatim. If I ask a question to somebody, if it's a specific question, I just started a short form thing that I would literally write a question mark and a square bracket. So that tells me, if I have that in the left-hand side of my page, question mark, square bracket, that tells me that whatever I've written just opposite that is in response to a question. If I have a specific question that I might, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I want to put this all together in the same place. If I've asked them a specific question about something, does she have any fears? I would write a note in my left-hand margin that would say question mark, fears, square bracket. And then everything else I would just write over in the right hand 80% of the page. That lets me, when I go back to do the case analysis, or when I go back to review that case, that lets me differentiate spontaneous declaration from the client from stuff that I've questioned. So at the end of it, I've got, several pages of that kind of information. Once the clients sort of come to the end of that, and they don't come to the end of that without some silence, and sometimes when they come, I get just, I'll say to them, I let the silence be a lot of times, because you can see they're thinking, or you can feel that they're thinking, and you don't want to get them out of that, because like this is the first time in their life that anybody's ever let them talk about their animals. And this is what I said at the beginning. I said, the stuff that you might be telling me might be stuff that you talk about with your girlfriends when you're talking about Fifi. It might not be stuff that they're used to talking about to your veterinarian. And so I might, as the pace of the gush of the anamnesis slows, I might start saying something like, anything else? Or can you think of anything else? Or is there anything else that you'd like to share? And at some point, and this is not like inquisitional, it's literally that casual. And at some point, it gets pretty clear that, they think they've told you everything they know at that point. So then what you do, I tend to just draw a line, or I make a question mark with the in my margin. And then I go back and I clarify any unique questions that I might have through the stuff that they've told me. Sometimes we can get a little bit of that information, as they're telling me. And oftentimes I'll do that, but I don't try and derail the conversation. And if I do, I try and get it back on their train tracks, not my train tracks. Then by the time that we're finished that, we may or may not have information about all the other stuff that's really important. Food preferences, sleeping habits, where do they sleep, when do they go to bed, do they change places during the night, what time do they get up in the morning, do they get up in the morning because the humans get up, or do they get up in the morning on their own, and what would happen, oh, they get up with me when I go to work. Well, what would happen, if you were to sleep in, or something like that. So we have those kinds of preferences. We have food preferences, and I don't, I'm really casual with the way that I ask people, is there anything they really like to eat, or what do they typically like to eat? Is there anything that, that man, they just love to have, or is there anything it just doesn't matter? No way, no how, they're not going to ever take that. We talk about relationship with water. How much water do they drink? Do they have a preference for fresh or not fresh, or ice cube? Do they eat ice? Those sorts of things. Relationship with water to me goes bigger than that. What about bathing? What about water from the sky? Will they walk in the rain? Will they walk through mud puddles? Those sorts of things. And again, I sometimes ask the question if you're out hiking in the woods and there's a mud puddle in the middle of the trail, would they go through that, or would they go around it? And does it bother them to have their feet wet? If you're out in the dew, they don't have any problem going across that line, or so I don't make suggestions to them, but I make up these little scenarios. And then so we've done relationship with water, cold, inside, outside, temperature. Oh, these really chilly. Well, how hot does it have to be before they're before they're warm? Or how cold does it have to be before they're chilly? Do you dress them up in the wintertime, or do you put raincoats or anything like that on them? How do they, what do they like with any kind of coats or clothing, or anything like that? I ask them about bathing. I ask them about going to the veterinarian. I ask them about what are they like in the car. What do they like when people come to visit your house? What would happen if I walked in your house? What would they do? Well, they do. Well, then what would they do if I just stood there? Then they tell me the story. I ask about, crating and confinement. I ask, I say all of those questions when I'm speaking to folks in these kinds of situations. And then I realize when I talk to my colleagues that laundry list of questions, a lot of folks never even think about asking. I ask them, do they have any fears? How do they show those fears? I was talking to a clinician the other day whose client told her that the animal is terrified, just absolutely horribly terrified of loud noises. And you say to the person, like, how does she show that? And oh, they look around and take 2 steps back. Now, I don't say to the client, "Oh my God, that's not terrified." I say, "Okay, that's terrified in this lady's mind." But I'm thinking, man, I knew a dog that would go right through a plate glass window every time there was a loud noise. That's terrified. So we need to be able to know what the animal's doing so that we have an idea about what the physical or mental or emotional manifestation of the thing is that the person is calling really terrified. And a lot of times you'll get information in a case taking, and when I read my early cases over, and when I read cases from other clinicians, and when I read cases when I'm mentoring, we come fairly quickly to the realization that we really don't have a clue what the heck the words on the page really mean when that is manifest in dogness or catness or cowness or whatever our patient is. So then I've gone through that big laundry list of things, and I'm happy to talk about more things on that laundry list later if you want. Then what I do is I actually do a verbal physical exam, and I go through just exactly the way I would do if I was making a physical exam. And I'm going to trust that everybody in the room here is a good enough clinician that they still remember how the heck to do a physical exam. So I literally go nose to tail. We start with the nose, and is it smooth? I'm going to use dog for an example because I'm just on dogs right now. Is it smooth? Is there any discoloration of the nose leather? Any cracking? Any discharges? And I start this part of it with, do they now or have they ever? So it doesn't matter whether that symptom's present right now or if it's historical and is gone, but do they now or have they ever? And literally go through nose to tail, any swellings in the face, gums, any tartar on the teeth, difficulty taking food, drooling, difficulty chewing. Did they have all their teeth when they were born? Did they hold their deciduous teeth or all their, and usually they'll say something, like, did all their teeth fall out at, the appropriate times, and that sort of thing. We talk about the eyes, difficulty seeing, any discharges, any swellings, anti-squinting, difficulty seeing at distance, recognizing people, strange movements of the eyeballs, any, all the way through those things. And you guys know what's in the repertoire. What sort of symptoms that we're going to try and clarify with these cases, and that can help inform your physical exam over the phone part, or in the office when you're doing this. The thing that I'll do when I'm doing that, any discharges from the ears? Oh yeah, I had ear discharges, and well, what do they look like? And sometimes people need a little push. And so what I will say to somebody, like, was it blue, green, or orange kind of thing? I will suggest the most ridiculously stupid possible color for a discharge out of a dog's ear, because that gets them to give me right away, no, it was whatever. And it wasn't, I was kind of bluey, greeny, greenish, grayish. That if you just give them a bizarre thing, and they'll tell you that. And that's the same in that earlier part, when they're talking about the fact that, the dog has had, quote, chronic ear infections. How did they show that? An ear infection means nothing to me as a homeopath. I want to know how they showed that thing that got the ear infection label. So how did they show that? Oh, they had all this stuff in their ear. Well, what'd that look like? And if they're struggling with that, is there a certain color, purple, green, or orange kind of? I don't use green, but purple, orange, or blue or something. So we go through the physical examination. Any difficulty breathing, any coughing, sneezing, any vomiting, like all the really crazy little things. And again, I'm happy to make you guys a list if that's useful to you. I hate to go through this really quickly because a lot of the stuff people don't ask then when they get somebody on the phone. But I tend to go by body systems, by organs, and by things that I would want to palpate and think about. So I'm I've got the dog on the table and I'm, eyes, ears, flip the mouth, look at this, wonder about the mouth, go through the lymph nodes, dip, 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 down the neck. So now we're talking about any muscle stiffness, pain, swelling, swallowing. And I talk in really broad brush strokes, but I'm also very specific. So I don't go through 97 million, musculoskeletal options, but I make sure that I cover that musculoskeletal system, any anal sacs, burps, farts, grumbly guts, and if they start with those kind of symptoms, then you can clarify those symptoms. Oh yeah, you say, well, what, like a burp, a fart, a grumbly gut, and then we talk about any difficulty pooping, peeing, positioning to pee or poop, any difficulty with toenails, so you've got any lumps, bumps, scrapes, those kinds of things. And I'm really, really broad, lumps, bumps, scrapes, dings on the upholstery. I did a whole intake with a lady one time, and I was talking to her about anal glands, and I was talking to her about skin, any itching, scratching, fleas, lumps, bumps. We got to the end of the thing, and oh my God, her dog had been in a car wreck and they'd amputated its tail. So we get to the end of all of the physical examination stuff, and I'm sort of sitting there and they're sort of sitting there, and sort of you can feel that the circle is starting to close. I mean, in a nice way, like we've kind of come to the end of something, a chapter, a page, a book. And the last thing that I say to the person is I say, can you describe her for me, please? If you were going to describe her, what would you say? And people very quickly, they might think for half a breath, they'll very quickly give you a list of 3 or 4 or 5 things. And it's done. It doesn't go on and on. It doesn't, it just, but you've got that descriptor. And a lot of times that descriptor part, the case is there. After I'm done that, I say to them, thank you very much. I think I've got as much information as I need, and things seem to be fairly clear to me now. But if I have any questions, or if I need any clarification, I'll get back with you. And I said, I'm not going to do very much with this today. I'm going to probably, maybe read over it and review the medical records, but I'm really not going to work the case probably until, tomorrow sometime, or later this week. It depends on the case. It depends on the schedule. You don't want to nail yourself down into promising to doing something tomorrow afternoon and it doesn't happen. That's not a good place to be, actually, usually. So I say, I'm going to look at the case later. And I say, look, now that your brain's sort of thinking about this, and you get back and you might be talking to your family or friends later, and if you think of anything else, feel free to either send me an email or leave a call or leave a message on my voicemail and just, let me know. Or if you're having dinner with your family tonight and they say, hey, Mom, did you tell them about such and such? And you've forgotten. I said, just leave a message. I said, don't feel bad about doing it because, and this is true in my practice, 60 to 80% of the people would call back with some detail. Sometimes it was a little detail. Sometimes it was a big detail. And so now you have this information. And part of what we're looking at in this information is patterns of presentation versus the labels and the diagnosis. And what we're looking at is a piece of material, that stack of yellow paper at the end of it that has that material down. I don't repertorize when I'm taking a case this way. I may have a remedy that I think about. I might jot it down in the margin. I may have questions that come up when the client's talking about other things or things that I forgot to ask. I tend to jot that in the right-hand side of the page. I just make a little line and jot it. I don't try and save paper when I'm taking cases. I leave lots of white space or yellow space and sort of put each new idea or each new statement down in its fresh line. So the pages look kind of, there's a lot of space space on them. But I find that that's useful coming back, and it's useful to separate thoughts and know where things kind of came up and took a breath. So that's the process of the case taking. I'm going to come up for air here for just a short minute and survey the crowd and see if anybody has any specific questions or comments. And I think Jeff has everybody muted. So if you can use your little raise your hand icon to raise your hand, or make a note in the, I think if I go farting around in the question box, it's going to make my slides go somewhere else. So is there anybody, any comment or question?
Everyone is unmuted. No, looks like no comments or questions so far.
I'll talk about that before the end. But one of the things that people say is, "Oh my God, this takes so long. I don't have time." And I'm just gonna put the question out there: is it easier to do this with full information, or to stagger around in the dark and spend a lot of time at other times? But we'll circle back to that. So now I got all this information, and I gotta figure out some symptoms to repertorize. So the choice of the rubrics and the rating of the symptoms are really important when we take the case, because what we're trying to do in these cases is separate what differentiates this particular individual from all the other individuals that you've ever seen ever in practice, and certainly what separates this individual from all the other individuals that you've ever seen that have been stuck with this diagnostic label. Anybody who knows me well knows, or even half well knows, that I don't deal with diagnostic labels typically. I'm going to give you a couple of hierarchies of symptoms that I found useful in using and finding and asking about the rubrics or the symptoms that we're going to use to create the rubrics that are going to help us guide us to the actual remedy that we're going to prescribe. We need to be able to differentiate the common symptoms in the case from the characteristic symptoms that are unique to and representative of that individual case. So we don't want to use those common symptoms of the diagnostic label. We just don't want to do that. We want to look at what makes this individual different. How is this individual presenting their chronic renal failure or their mast cell tumor or their epilepsy or their whatever else label differently than all of those other things? If possible, don't prescribe on those common symptoms, or don't prescribe on symptoms that describe pathology or diagnosis. I see that happen a lot in some cohorts of our colleagues, and I struggled with that for a long time, but I think on reflection and questioning over the last 3 to 5 to 7 or so years, it's because they don't have the other symptoms, because they haven't extracted them not extracted them like I'm going to extract this like it's a dentist pulling a tooth, but because they haven't set up the environment so that the client reveals the information. It's more of an inquisition than an anamnesis, or they're depending too much on medical records and they're looking at it from the medical record stuff. It's hard enough to shake this when we're, getting ourselves rewired as a homeopath, but it is even harder if we keep ourselves trapped in the medical record kind of stuff. Don't be prescribing on stuff you're making up. So don't prescribe on uncertain stuff, and don't prescribe on assumed stuff. Sometimes you can throw it in there to the case analysis and see if it supports a group of remedies that you're already considering, or it takes the case in a totally different direction. For those of you who know me, you know that I do use mental and emotional symptoms. I think they can be really useful, but you don't want to make crap up, and you don't want to be so anthropomorphic that you're presuming that these guys think like humans. They think like dogs or cows or horses or whatever. But I personally find those symptoms really, really useful. The other thing that is really important, particularly when you get cases that have had a whole lot of different stuff happen to them over time, or where the symptoms have shifted, some of them shift really quickly, and that's a whole other discussion. But remember to try and look and determine and figure out what the symptom looked like originally before it got modified by any kind of treatment, whether that's homeopathic care or whether that's other kinds of care. And other kinds of care could include the client doctoring on them as well. And so, when I'm getting that, do you remember, oh, you had ear infections? Yeah. Do you remember how that was when it started? Do you remember what year it was in? Was it in one year, or time of year that it happened, or what was going? And a lot of times, if you just give them a little bit of a bump, did it happen in the spring? No. Do you remember what's going on when that happened? Oh, we were on vacation, and da 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 da. We were at my sister's wedding. It was Christmas. We had to go to the emergency clinic. Whatever. And that's really, really, really helpful. That original symptom is really helpful when we have chronic cases that have been confused by all of these non-curative therapies. And it's helpful for a couple of reasons. It's helpful because it'll give us something to perhaps use in our materia medica study and our repertorization. But it's also really helpful because that somewhere down the trail, as this animal responds to our remedy selection, that they're going to show us that symptom in its virgin, unadulterated state. And when you've seen that you really got some traction in the case. Yes, it can be positive to have big, heavy, thick, dark ear discharges turn to lighter yellow and more fluidy and that sort of stuff. That is certainly positive. But when something happens and they go, oh my God, that just looks exactly like it looked when he was 3 months old, you've hit the mother lode. So it's really helpful to have those things. It's really important to differentiate between normal and usual. Just because it's always happened or just because it's always present doesn't mean it's normal. And I'll say to say, oh, that's his normal self. No, that's his usual self, And I actually differentiate those words when I talk to people. And, oh, that's normal for the breed. No, it might be usual for the breed. But when we look at what is species normal, is that species normal? And, we could step out for a beer or a glass of wine or a cup of tea or something and talk about, those things that are breed normal because of the deep-seated intergenerationally inherited chronic disease that we see in breeds. And that's that's different than normal or truly healthy breed or species normal. So I'm just going to go through a couple of different ways to look at symptoms. And I don't want, these are not, you can use them in their individual kind of way, or you can sort of cross-pollinate between these different ways of looking at things. So I'm just going to go through some ways to start looking at grouping and identifying symptoms, and also putting those symptoms in a hierarchy so that if you've got this is much more significant than if you've got that. So in the hierarchy of symptoms, we want to look at peculiars. If we have a peculiar symptom, that's very important, and it should be something on which we base a prescription. That should read in the remedy. The other thing is mentals. And again, as I said earlier, if we've got good, clear, reliable mentals, they're also very important. We know that as bodies are sick, I was taught for years that diseases first manifest as a rent in the spirit that then gets manifest in the mental, emotional, and then the physical being. So if we can have those clear mental symptoms that are accurate, we know that is very close to that dynamic disruption of the of the spirit, that deep, deep, that deep thing that touched things to make them, veer off down the trail of the chronic disease. And then we look at generals. So we look at rubrics that we find in generalities. Generals are things that affect the whole patient. So rubrics from generalities: time and temperature. We look at sleep modalities: position, increased, decreased, waking, dreaming, noisy, indisposed to rise is one that's often useful. We look at food aversions and desires. We look at menses. We see a lot of cases where we don't know anything about that because they're all spayed before they've ever had any kind of a reproductive declaration at all. But I look at that always. And I'm really, really, really picky about heat cycles in dogs, because over the years I've found that, oh, this is normal for this breed to have a heat cycle every 10 or 11 months. I find that those animals under homeopathic care actually don't have a heat cycle every 10 or 11 months. They actually come back and have, a 6-month cycle. I look at sexual behaviors, humping. I look at whether they have an erection in intact male dogs. I look at humping, chasing, heat cycles. If we've got animals that are acting in reproductive capacities, looking at those sorts of things. I look at body type sometimes. I'm going to dodge that one right now and put it on the shelf. But there are some things that we can look at about general things about bodies and heat and temperatures and those kinds of things. And I also look at modalities and modifiers, things that make things better or worse, activities that happen that precede something or that may improve something, those kinds of things. And then I look at the local physical. You've got a bump on their big toe. I've got a wart on my backside. I've got discharge from my left ear. And then you think about those modalities to local physicals. Is there anything that makes that wart on my backside feel better or worse? Is there anything that happened that preceded that? I got a wart on my backside after I got, slapped or injected or whatever. And so that's one way of sort of organizing symptoms, so that when you go through and read all of those pages of information that you've got, that you can actually put some sort of a label on these symptoms that you've written down so studiously. Another way to look at them is, and when we talk about peculiars, I'm going to look at those peculiar symptoms. If we've got these symptoms, these are really good symptoms to hang your hat upon. So if we have an etiology, a causation, ailments from, and the common ones are grief and anger and jealousy, injuries, allopathic medicines or non-curative medicines or non-curative manipulations, vaccinations, suppressions of eruptions or discharges or menses. This is only true if we see just because any of those things are in the history doesn't mean that it's an etiology or an ailment from. So just because the animal has been vaccinated doesn't mean that the vaccination caused the chronic disease. We see some individuals that are vaccinated, and it really doesn't make all that much difference to them. They might be repeatedly vaccinated. We know that it wears out the vitality and all of that sort of stuff, but it really doesn't make all that much difference to the pattern and the cadence and the rhythm of their pre-existing chronic disease. So it's not like they got vaccinated and boom, something flared. It's just they got vaccinated and away we went. Sometimes that's not true, but I often see people make the assumption that because they've got vaccinated, that's a bad thing and it made their chronic disease worse. And it's just quite honestly not always true. The other thing is that I see, I'm having a minor rant about vaccinations, is that every animal that got vaccinated by definition has vaccinosis. And that's also not true. So we need to differentiate the difference between receiving a vaccine and actually developing a group of symptoms that are related to the vaccine that has been received, so that the vaccine energy actually grafts itself onto the chronic disease and shows you a certain type of and a certain presentation of patterns of things, which are going to depend and vary a little bit on the particular vaccine. So don't fall into that trap. Don't fall into the trap that just because they might have had a housemate die, that they necessarily have an ailment from grief. But if they've had a housemate die and suddenly their pattern changes markedly or even half markedly, or suddenly they have something that had been trucking along at 30 miles an hour and their housemate died and now it's going 60 miles an hour, or it shows up in a totally different way, that is really, really, really significant. So remember, when you're using these, that it has to have an influence on the symptoms, either create new symptoms that we've never seen before, or change the articulation or cadence or pace or direction of symptoms that might have already been present. We look at keynotes. We could talk for 47 days about keynotes. I'm going to paint with a really broad brush here and just talk about symptoms, accurate symptoms that are central, important to the case, characteristic to the case, where they only have a very few remedies listed in the repertory. But those symptoms have really got to be significant to that case, the whole totality of that case. We look at alternating symptoms. They can really, really be useful. If we have constipation that alternates with diarrhea, if we have itching that alternates with vomiting, if we have a backache that alternates with a headache, those kinds of things. Sometimes you can see those in animals. Sometimes they're not as easy to see in animals, but they're really, really useful if you've got them. The other one is periodic symptoms. I find these more commonly than you might imagine, because I tend to ask people to write stuff down or make a mark on the calendar when something happens. And so sometimes we find things that are not, that seem to be random, but they're random and repeating, and oh my gosh, they're fine, and then they're not fine, and then they're fine, and then they're not fine. They actually are periodic when we write them down. So we might see something that happens every 2 weeks. We might see something that happens on the full moon. We might see something that happens at a certain time of day. We might see something that happens every third day. If you're not looking for the every third day or every fourth day and you don't write it down, it just looks like, oh my gosh, things are okay, and oh my God, now they're not okay, and I thought they were getting okay and they're not anymore, and what's happening? And then they calm down again. And if you ask people to write those down, oftentimes you'll see that. I tend to find, interestingly, that arsenicum tends to be a remedy that sometimes looks like that, and when we write them down, we start to see that periodicity that we know that remedy for, or at least in my experience, that's been one of the things. Vicarious symptoms, we don't see very many of these in animals. We see them in humans, not every single day, but sometimes we'll see the example here is that instead of having a menses, a lady will have a nosebleed. So it's where something that's supposed to be happening, something happens instead of something else. Extensions, they're really hard to determine in animals. It's things go from the shoulder to the wrist versus the wrist to the shoulder. Or I have something that starts over here and radiates to this other side of my body. Or I have a history where the arthritic lesions started in the hip and went to the knee and went to the ankle, as opposed to starting in the ankle and went to the knee and went to the hip. Those are really useful and helpful. You can sometimes see them historically in animals, but they're hard to, that this pain goes from point A to point B. The other one that are really useful in humans, wildly useful in humans, are those sensations. And we know, we have the sensations as if repertories and those sorts of stuff. So it feels like I have a knife in my ear, or I have a ball in my rectum, or I have a fishbone stuck in my throat or something. And that's why it's really important to write down what people say, because they'll give you that. But again, those sensations things are hard to figure out in animals. But we're talking here about peculiar symptoms. And those symptoms, if you've got those peculiar symptoms, by George, they're so useful. And sometimes, if you've got those and maybe a modality or two to something else, that can be your whole case. You don't need to go from there. The other peculiar and are that can be really useful in animals. A, they're frequent, and B, they're often easy to see. So we see concomitants, things that happen together at the same time. We know that just like the notes say, that every time you have diarrhea, you have salivation. We might have like an itchy chest when I have an ear discharge on my left ear, or whatever that is. If anybody's read anything that Boyerke has written, that concomitants are a favorite of his. You also know that Bonninghausen likes them a lot, and Richard likes them a lot too, as we start looking at using some of those different repertories over the years. The other one that is frequent and is really useful is that when the expected symptom is missing. So one of the ones that I find really helpful in animals is that itching without eruptions. And that's also going back to trying to determine what did that symptom look like originally. By the time you might get there, they're all bald, red, and itching, or there's marks, or stuff has happened. But when that dog first started itching, were there any marks? Was there anything there? So that's useful. The vomiting without nausea. I can remember talking to Glenn Dupree about flying in an airplane with somebody, and they were having this wonderful conversation, and the way they went, and they were just flying along, and all of a sudden the lady reached over, took out the little bag from the seat, threw up, didn't miss a beat in the conversation, threw the bag away and went, and she didn't have any bit, it was none of this, oh man, I think this is getting bumpy and I'm not happy and she's getting sweaty, and nothing. She just didn't make, and that's I would prescribe on that. So another couple of the peculiars, are that as if I feel as if I've got a tight band around my head. I feel as if there is cold water running down my leg. I feel as if there's a mouse crawling up my leg. I feel as if my uterus is going to fall out if I walk. Those kinds of things. They tend to be mental characterizations. I feel as if there's a spider web over my face. Mental or sensorial kinds of things, and they're really hard to deal with in animals, but if you've got them in humans, those are useful. And then we've got those strange, rare, and peculiar things that are just so weird. The lady that told me one time that her dog would take quote, he'll take me out for a piece of lettuce. I said to her, what do you mean? Oh man, it doesn't matter where that dog is in the house. If I open the fridge and if he hears me starting to make a salad and breaking lettuce, he comes from anywhere and he'll just knock me over to get that lettuce. That's weird. And I use it actually for the remedy. So again, that's another group of symptoms, a way to manage symptoms that we can start making a hierarchy of all this information. How do we sort out the things that are more useful and less useful? And the other thing is to remember, we don't need to repertorize every darn thing that we've got in there. First of all, I mean, we need to make sure that we have the symptoms that express the totality of the case. We may have some symptoms that are really important to the case, but they might not be repertorizable. And so we need to just remember that when we do the follow-up, we do a follow-up based on that whole broad group of symptoms. So we look at, we talk about characteristic symptoms. You should take the symptoms that are characteristic. What the heck does that really mean, So characteristic symptoms tend to be persistent. They've had them for a long time, or they can't shake them. They tend to be recurrent. They're periodic by season. They may be periodic by time. They may be periodic by activity. Every time I do X, Y happens. They may tend to be intense or severe, particularly if it's painfulness or particularly if it's an emotional state. We look at, also we look at mental symptoms. We look at, behavioral things. liquors and aggressives and fears and those kinds of things can be very characteristic. We look at general symptoms, the things that affect the entire patient versus the local or particular symptoms. The other thing is we look at modalities a lot of times, and a lot of times, we can build a case on that symptom and a modality and then another symptom, and you've got three legs under your stool and away you go. And I'll talk to that really briefly in a minute. Particulars, when we look at really interesting things that involve a particular part of the body, and then we look at some unusual symptoms that just don't make sense in our clinical experience. They're odd, or they're strange, or they're irregular or unexplained. And so, just those examples. I got arthritis that's better with cold or wet. That's unusual. It's common to have arthritises that are better with heat. And having said that, that may not be a really useful symptom when you start repertorizing, for example. But it's very unusual to have them feel better, when it's cold or when the animal or human is wet. So that just gives you some ways of looking at how we might arrange or rearrange or prioritize the symptoms that we're talking about. So in the interest of it's 9 o'clock, I just want to go through and make a couple points, and we'll open up the questions. I asked this earlier. People, we're always looking at how do we save time as clinicians and that sort of stuff. And my question always is it short-term savings at the time of the intake for sort of, and if I spend time at the intake and the anamnesis and get that information, I find that several things happen. One is I've got a very different relationship with my client than if it's the inquisitional question asking thing. And that's because it's not the inquisitional question asking thing. And we're actually having a conversation in voice instead of having them write something out in isolation or fill out a checklist or something like that. So I find what's been true for me is that there seems to be better continuity both with communication with the client, but also in the case management, because you've got that threads of stuff. And what I find, and I can certainly say this when I go back and reflect on my time mentoring folks and also on my clinical time, is that what you save on this, like you can't rob Peter to save Paul. And what I find is when folks take this approach rather than, oh my God, I got to get it all because I only have 20 minutes or half an hour, and that their case analysis is better, their case management is better. They tend to be more accurate with their first prescription or their second prescription, and it just the whole feel of stuff changes markedly. So the speedy intake thing, the other thing that I find is if we haven't done that sort of longer anamnesis intake, we don't really know the historical pattern of the symptoms for follow-up. And so it's kind of, it's kind of like taking a dog out of the shelter. Yeah, you can prescribe for them, and you certainly can, don't get me wrong. But that richness of that long-term historical pattern is there. The other thing that if you have that is that you can clearly say to the client, this is, I don't know what they're going to do, but this is what I would expect to see. It's going to let you prognosticate. It's going to let you build some confidence with the client because you're going to know what you're going to see these, and you can tell them, as we treat, I would expect to see that, this symptom that might not have been present for, a couple years, you might just see that back, or you might see, things going more exterior than interior, and what their pattern has been because you've got that in the history. So you can prognosticate, and that's going to build confidence between you and your client, and it's going to be a whole lot easier to help them be brave when the sailing gets rocky. So you can take that big mashed up wood pile through this, and you can actually start to see pattern. You can actually start to see shape. You can actually start to see substance, and that's it's not a whole bunch of little things in isolation. It's not this dot, this dot, this dot, this dot. It's when we look at this dot, this dot, this dot, this dot, it actually makes us a picture. It's isn't it Monet that painted that the people on the river walking, in pointillism. If you get up to it close, it doesn't look like anything, and when you step back, oh my gosh, there's a whole picture there. And that's the thing that we're trying to do when we're taking a case. What if there is truly no history? It's really rare that there's truly no history. They might have got the dog a week ago, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a month ago. They might have bought the horse at the auction sale. So you may, you just work with what you got. You get to be a better observer. You get to be able to start to think about not what you want to hear, but what do you need to build that case. Sometimes directed questions can be useful with that. Farm animals versus pets is a real interesting thing because I can be a real stickler for taking a full case. And I do the same thing when I'm working with farm animals. And, depending on the time of the year, 80+% of my practice is farm animal practice. But even more than that sometimes. But what happens is you still go through that same thought process that I just outlined there, but you realize that you may not have the information. And so you may direct questions a little bit more. You may look at the presenting complaint and what makes it better or worse. You may look at historical stuff. If we don't do that, what we end up is a whole bunch of stuff of treating things in isolation, and you're not going to recognize that, when the cow that are at a really great case, we actually may give it for a case. Gregory and Gregory Pace is going to do some webinars for us this year, but we may give this one as a case. But a goat, and this was one of his family animals that presented with an uveitis, and then sometime later, like quite a long time later, presented with a mastitis, and then sometime later presented with a really interesting huge udder. But it was so interesting that, oh my gosh, she's got mastitis, but wait a minute, it's relatively healthier to have a mastitis than an uveitis, and the mastitis was an exteriorization of symptoms, and that wasn't appreciated when they first started. Oh my gosh, we're treating mastitis in first aid rather than treating it as the exteriorization of symptoms that it was, even though it took a year to get them exterior. So we need to sort of be cognizant that that those things happen in farm animals as well. And people say, oh, you can't do real homeopathy in farm animals because you can't get the kind of history that we take on those big intakes. And I'm here to tell you that is a misperception and a misunderstanding, or a lack of experience, or whatever polite way. We can do it. It's certainly possible to do it. We do it, every day, and you can treat with that same level of deep, life-changing stuff and certainly we can do that, with individual. If we're at a place where we're prescribing individually for horses or cattle or that kind of stuff, we can still see that great, amazing, life-changing stuff that happens with accurate prescribing and good follow-up. So we're a little bit after 9 o'clock. I'm happy to take any questions. Either, again, I think Jeff's got everybody unmuted, but I'm not sure, or by typing them into the question box.
Yep, Linda and Stephanie were unmuted. I'm just muting the others. And we can also...
No, I'm not!
Okay.
Oh, somebody's not happy.
Yeah, maybe.
And we covered a lot of ground here fairly quickly, but...
Oh, Susan, this is Betty Jo. Can you hear me?
I can. Hi, it's nice to hear you.
I found long ago that taking the cases long distance over the phone, really, most of those were my best cases. And so it was nice to hear that you've learned that too.
Oh my, yeah. And I love to see the animals. Don't get me wrong. And I understand some of our legal obligatory, but yes, I absolutely. Some of my very, very, very best cases were were individuals that I never met the clients in person, and I never saw their animals.
Yeah, me
And
too.
and I
Yeah.
yeah, and you know, that's, I don't think either one of us are bragging, but I'm here to tell you that it's possible. And some of the worst cases that I hear from clinicians are cases, you know, where they're right there, and it's just because they're not taking, you know, the fact that you can see them doesn't necessarily mean that the case is better.
Yeah, it was also helpful that you were able to explain how creating the environment affects that. And I too found that when I was seeing more clients in the hospital, I would get distracted, you know,
Mm-hmm.
from
Mm-hmm.
the differences. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you
Mm-hmm.
for your wonderful lecture today.
Well, thank you for your comments and for sharing that experience. And it's nice to hear it, you know, and you've had some trail, you know, this isn't the first week you've ever done this, and it's just, you know, it's just nice to hear that's been effective for you. And I talked to some of my colleagues and some of our colleagues who haven't been on this trail as long, and just even doing this a couple of times, they notice that difference that happens, and it's really powerful, I think.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Great. Yep. Yep. And I would also concur with Betty Jo. Thanks so much, Sue, for this fantastic hour plus, and all of everything you said was just spot on. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Any other questions, anyone? Okay. So nothing showing up in the chat. Anything you want to add, Judy or Sue or Henrietta? Nope. Okay. Well,
Okay. We
Sue,
meet again on the 13th of February, right, Jeff?
whatever the second Wednesday is. Yep.
Oh, second Wednesday in February is the 13th. Yeah.
Yep.
So just to let everybody know. And that,
Yep.
and these recordings will be available on where? The AVH website?
Right now, just email Kathy for the recording links.
Okay.
Anyone that's not here won't know that, but I can remind that on the on the list.
Okay. Perfect.
Great. So thank you
Great.
again, Sue,
Thanks,
and
guys.
we will see you all very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You guys.
Bye-bye.